They said I've been replaced.
Then you come home with me. I think I'm falling in love with you.
Then fall. I'll be right here.
Mail-order bride was told. She'd been replaced, the cowboy whispered. Then she comes home with me. Redemption, Texas. A Western story of love and belonging. The stagecoach wheezed to a halt like a dying animal, finally allowed to rest, and Josephine Ali understood, with perfect clarity, that she had reached the edge of the world. She knew. Through the dust-caked window, Redemption, Texas, spread before her a single street of false front buildings, leaning against each other like drunks sharing secrets. The July heat, so thick she could see it shimmer off the packed earth, like water that would never come. Do you want to discover how a proper Boston woman finds love in the Untamed Westkeep reading, to witness a journey of courage, redemption, and unexpected belonging? She had been traveling for 3 weeks. 3 weeks since she'd locked the door of her father's shop for the last time, the brass key turning with a finality that echoed in her bones. 3 weeks of trains that screamed through the night, of way stations that smelled of unwashed bodies and unfulfilled dreams, of landscape that gradually shed its civilized skin until only the raw bones of earth remained. Her fingers found the bundle of letters in her reticule, 37 letters from Mr. Edwin Porter, each one promising a future as neat and ordered as the columns in her father's ledgers had been before the debts ate them alive. The driver, a man whose face looked like leather left too long in the sun, yanked open the door. Redemption, miss. End of the line. End of the line. The words sat in her throat like stone. She gathered her traveling dress, navy wool, entirely wrong for this heat, but the only thing respectable enough for a first meeting with one's intended, and stepped down. Her boots, good Boston leather that had walked civilized streets, met ground that had never known cobblestones. The earth grabbed at her heels as if to say, "You don't belong here. Go back." But there was nothing to go back to. The consumption had taken her father in March, eating him from the inside, while creditors ate everything else from the outside. The shop, the rooms above it, even her mother's piano, all gone to satisfy debts that multiplied like rodents in the walls. The factory where she'd found work had burned in May, taking with it the last honest employment for women in her district. The advertisement in the Boston Globe, "Gentlemen of means in Western territories seek correspondence with marriageable ladies of good character," had seemed like Providence itself. Now, standing in this blast furnace of a street, she wondered if Providence had a cruel sense of humor. Miss Allie A., thin man, materialized from the shadow of the general store, like a secret being told reluctantly. His skull showed through his hair, which he'd slicked with pomade that was already surrendering to the heat. His suit was the color of cities, but cut wrong for anywhere, as if it had been made by someone who'd only heard descriptions of clothing but never seen it worn. Frederick Toombs, Mr. Porter's associate. The pause before associate was long enough to bury hope in. Mr. Toombs. She held out her gloved hand, a gesture from another world. He looked at it as if she'd offered him something contaminated, then gave it a brief shake that felt like an apology nobody had asked for. "I sent a telegram from Abilene with my expected arrival." "Yes, well." His mouth shaped itself around words that tasted bad. "Circumstances have altered since your correspondence began. Mr. Porter has, that is to say, he has entered into matrimony with Mrs. Blackwell, a widow of considerable standing. The ceremony was performed Tuesday last. Tuesday. She had been somewhere in the New Mexico territory on Tuesday, watching the landscape burn red as blood, while she read Edwin's latest letter, the one that spoke of the house. He was preparing the garden plot already turned for her arrival. Tuesday, when she was becoming something new, he was choosing something familiar. "I see." Her voice came from very far away, as if her body were a telegraph station receiving messages from her soul. And he did not think to send word. It was quite sudden. Toombs pulled at his collar, which was winning its own war against his neck. Mrs. Blackwell, Mrs. Porter. Now her period of mourning ended, and Mr. Porter felt, well, a man must consider his position in the community. Behind Toombs, faces appeared in windows like pictures being hung. The town was assembling itself for a show, and she was the entertainment. A woman in a doorway, hair the color of butter, dress the color of money, watched, with the satisfaction of someone who'd won a hand of cards she hadn't even been dealing. Mr. Porter wishes to extend his sincerest apologies. Toombs continued producing an envelope from his jacket, like a magician whose trick had gone wrong, and has provided funds for your return passage. The eastbound stage departs tomorrow morning. Return passage, as if she were a package sent to the wrong address, something to be returned to sender with regrets. Josephine looked at the envelope, cream paper, good quality Edwin seal in red wax, like a drop of blood, and didn't take it. Her hands stayed folded at her waist, holding on to dignity like it was the last solid thing in a world gone liquid. I have no home to return to, Mr. Toombs. My father is dead. His debts took what the consumption didn't. That is, regrettable. He held the envelope between them like a bridge she should cross. Nevertheless, Mr. Porter's obligation was stated clearly in 37 letters. The number came out sharp, each digit a small wound. I have them all if you'd care to review his promises. Now see here. Toombs started, color rising in his shallow cheeks. Everything all right here? The voice arrived like shade in a place that had forgotten clouds, deep, unhurried, with the kind of authority that came from knowing the ground you stood on because you'd walked every inch of it. Josephine turned. The man stood with the sun at his back, so she saw him first as a shape cut from light, broad shoulders, worn hat, the suggestion of strength held in reserve. As her eyes adjusted, details emerged. Chambray shirt faded to the color of morning sky, leather vest that had seen seasons change, boots that told truth about the miles they'd covered. His face was all angles and weather, cheekbones that could cut glass, jaw that had set itself against harder things than this awkward scene. But his eyes, clear blue, like water running over stones, held something gentle despite their directness. This is a private matter, Toombs said, his voice climbing toward indignation. The stranger's gaze moved from Toombs to Josephine, taking in her traveling dress, her rigid posture, the envelope hanging between them like a white flag nobody wanted to claim. He studied her face, not long enough to be improper, exactly long enough to understand. Seems to me the lady might want to say in how private it stays, he said. His voice had the kind of calm that preceded action, like the moment before thunder. I assure you, Mr. Sullivan, Wade Sullivan, I own the Broken Spur Ranch north of town. He removed his hat, revealing hair the brown of earth after rain shot through with early silver, though he couldn't be more than 35. And you are Josephine Ali. She said it to him, not to the street, not to the watching windows, just to him. Miss Ali came as a mail-order bride, Toombs announced, his voice loud enough to ensure the gossip would have accuracy, if not kindness. To Mr. Porter, there has been a misunderstanding. We are arranging her return. Wade's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. A misunderstanding. He said it flat, not a question, just laying the word out to see how foolish it looked in daylight. The lady traveled 2,000 miles on a promise. And you call it a misunderstanding, Mr. Porter's circumstances changed. Yes, I heard about the wedding. Miranda Blackwell always did know how to time things. There was history in the way he said the name old water under older bridges. But that's Porter's failing, not Miss Ali's. What would you have us do? Toombs demanded. The arrangement cannot proceed. Wade looked at Josephine, then really looked, as if seeing past the dust and exhaustion to something essential underneath. Miss Ali, how long did you correspond with Porter? 8 months, she answered, finding her voice steadier than expected. And in those 8 months, did he make promises? Many. Did you make plans based on those promises? I sold everything I owned to buy passage here? Wade nodded slowly, then turned back to Toombs. Where I come from, a man's word is his bond. If he breaks it, he pays more than coach fare. Are you threatening? I'm stating facts. Here's another one. I need a wife. The words landed in the street like boots on a porch, solid and purposeful. The watching faces multiplied. Even the horses at the hitching post turned to look. Wade continued, speaking to Josephine now. I won't pretty it up with poetry. My ranch needs a woman's hand. The books are a mess. The house echoes like a tomb, and my men eat beans 6 nights a week because that's all any of us can cook. I'm offering marriage legal proper with your name on the deed alongside mine. Partnership, not ownership. This is highly irregular, Toombs sputtered. So is abandoning a woman who crossed the country on your word. Wade hadn't raised his voice once, but Toombs stepped back as if shoved. Miss Ali, I know you don't know me from Adam, but I know you came here with courage enough to marry a stranger faith, enough to trust letters, and grit enough to stand in this heat in wool dress without fainting. That tells me more than most courtships would. Josephine felt the street spinning slowly, not from heat, but from the sheer velocity of change. This morning she'd been Edwin Porter's intended. Now she stood between humiliation and the unknown, with a man whose eyes promised nothing but what he could deliver. Mr. Sullivan, she said carefully, you're offering marriage to a woman you've known for 5 minutes. I'm offering choice to a woman who's been left without one. He glanced at the envelope still hanging from Toombs's fingers. That paper there is defeat dressed up as kindness. What I'm offering is a chance to become what you came here to be, your own woman, with your own land, your own say. But I won't rush you to it. Mrs. Grayson runs a respectable boarding house. I'll cover your room while you decide. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing, I'll show you the ranch. You can judge with your own eyes whether it's a life you could build. And if I decide against, then I'll pay your passage to anywhere you want to go, not back forward. Your choice. The blonde woman had emerged fully from her doorway, now silk rustling like snakes in grass. Her smile was the kind that cut rather than curved. This had to be the new Mrs. Porter, the widow Blackwell, who'd swooped in like a hawk on a rabbit. Josephine looked at her at the triumph, poorly disguised as sympathy. Then at Toombs with his sweating discomfort at the envelope that would send her back to nothing. And finally at Wade Sullivan, who stood patient as stone, offering futures instead of apologies. Mr. Toombs, she said, her voice carrying the kind of clarity that comes from burning bridges while still standing on them, please inform Mr. Porter that I decline his generous offer of return passage. It seems I have business to conduct in redemption after all. She turned to Wade. Mr. Sullivan, I accept your hospitality, though I promise nothing beyond tomorrow's visit. That's all I'm asking, he said, and something in his eyes, relief maybe, or recognition, made her believe he meant it. Mrs. Grayson turned out to be the kind of woman who could read a situation like scripture and respond with the exact grace needed. She appeared from her establishment, a 2-story house, that managed to look both stern and welcoming, with the timing of someone who'd been watching from behind lace curtains. You'll be wanting a room, dear, she said to Josephine, not a question, but a gentle command. Come along. The men can sort their business while we get you settled. As Josephine followed her, she heard Wade's voice behind them, low. But carrying Toombs, you tell Porter he owes the lady more than coach fare. I'll be expecting him to make it right. He owes her nothing beyond. He owes her the dignity of an apology delivered in person. You tell him that. And tell him Wade Sullivan has a long memory for men who don't keep their word. Inside Mrs. Grayson's, the temperature dropped 10 degrees, and civility increased 100-fold. The older woman, 60 if a day, with silver hair pinned like armor and eyes that missed nothing, led Josephine upstairs that complained honestly under their feet. Been running this place 20 years, she said conversationally. Seen all kinds of situations walk through that door. Yours isn't the first, won't be the last. But Wade Sullivan standing up for you now, that's something. That man doesn't involve himself in other people's business, unless he sees something worth defending. She opened a door to reveal a room simple as a prayer iron bed, with a quilt that looked handmade with love, if not skill washstand with pitcher and basin window, that caught the western light like honey in a jar. You rest, Mrs. Grayson said. Supper's at 6. Stew tonight, and I make it thick enough to fill the hollow spaces. When she left, Josephine sat on the bed, the first stillness she'd known in 3 weeks. She unpinned, her hat pulled off her gloves finger by finger, and noticed her hands were shaking, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the sheer velocity of change. This morning she'd awakened as one person. Tonight she'd sleep as another. Between those 2 points, her life had broken and reformed like a bone that might heal stronger or might never bear weight again. She pulled out Edwin's letters tied with ribbon she now saw was the color of cowardice. The first one had been so careful, so proper. Dear Miss Ali, I read your advertisement with great interest. The last posted just 2 weeks ago. My darling Josephine, soon you will make my house a home. Lies dressed in penmanship. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Grayson entered with a tray coffee that smelled like civilization bread still warm from the oven butter that hadn't gone rancid in the heat. Don't know when you ate last, she said, setting it on the small table by the window. But I know that look. That's a woman who's been living on hope and stomach acid. Beside the plate sat another envelope, this one brown paper humble with her name written in a hand that didn't try to be fancy. Mr. Sullivan left this, Mrs. Grayson said, then tactfully withdrew. Inside the message was brief. Miss Ali, you need time and room to think. I respect that. If you're willing to see the ranch tomorrow, I'll be outside at 8 with horses. The mare is gentle. The land isn't, but it's honest. W. Sullivan below, his signature folded neat enough bills to cover a week's room and board or passage to San Francisco or anywhere else that might become home. Not charity choice. She ate slowly, watching the sun paint redemption in shades of gold and shadow. The town settled into evening routines, shopkeepers pulling in their signs, horses being led to stables, the saloon piano starting its nightly argument with melody. This wasn't what she'd planned. But then plans were just stories you told yourself about the future, and she'd learned that the future had its own ideas. Josephine woke to the sound of hammering, not violent, just purposeful, like someone building rather than breaking. Through the window dawn came pale as milk, promising another day of heat that would press down like a flat iron on wet cloth. She'd slept in her chemise, her traveling dress hung carefully to air out the 3 weeks of journey embedded in its fibers. The water in the pitcher was cool, a small miracle in this heat. She washed slowly, letting the cloth wake her skin inch by inch, bringing her back to her body after weeks of living mainly in hope and motion. In the mirror above the washstand, her face looked older than its 26 years, not aged, but seasoned like wood that had learned weather. She chose her second-best dress, blue cotton with small white flowers, that her mother had embroidered the summer before the consumption came calling. It was too heavy for Texas, but it had a dignity her traveling dress had lost somewhere in Kansas. Her hands moved through the familiar ritual of hairpins and braids, creating order where she could. Downstairs, Mrs. Grayson's dining room was already active. 2 men in merchant clothes bent over their eggs. A woman Josephine recognized from yesterday's windows sat with a child who kicked his feet against his chair in rhythm, with some internal music. And in the corner alone sat Wade Sullivan. He'd been up a while, she could tell. His shirt was fresh, but his boots already carried dust, as if he'd already been out to check something that couldn't wait for business hours. When he saw her, he stood not performatively, just naturally, as if standing when a woman entered was encoded in his bones. Miss Ali, you sleep all right. Well enough. Thank you. She took the chair Mrs. Grayson indicated across from him, where the light fell even. Coffee he poured. Without waiting for an answer, his hands steady and sure. She noticed they were clean, but marked a healing cut across one knuckle, calluses that spoke of ropes and reins, a thumbnail black from some recent disagreement with a hammer. I should tell you, she said, surprising herself by speaking first, I know nothing about ranching. I'd be worried if you claimed you did. He buttered a biscuit with the kind of attention that suggested he wasn't taking anything for granted. What do you know about numbers? Ledgers? I kept my father's books from the time I was 14. I can make $30 stretch to cover $40 worth of goods. I can mend anything made of cloth and some things that aren't. I read Latin, though I can't imagine that's useful here. I can cook, but only Eastern dishes. I've never seen a cow that wasn't already butchered. He smiled, then, not broad, just a slight lift at the corners that changed his whole face, from stern to possible. Latin might not help with the cattle, but it means you can think in more than one language. That's useful anywhere. As for the rest, ranch life is just problems that need solving. Sounds like you've been solving problems a while. Mr. Sullivan Wade. If we're going to talk honest, might as well start with names. Wade. The name felt strange in her mouth, too intimate for strangers, too casual for what they were discussing. Why do you need a wife? Really need, not just want. He set down his coffee cup, considering. My mother died 3 years ago. Fever took her in 2 days. Barely had time to say goodbye. My father followed 6 months later. Doctor said it was his heart, but I think he just decided not to stay where she wasn't. The house has been empty since then. Not empty of things, empty of life. The men I hire drift because there's nothing to anchor them. The books are a disaster because I'm out working sunup to past dark. The ranch is surviving, but that's not the same as thriving. You could hire a housekeeper. A bookkeeper. Have, actually. The housekeepers last about a month before the isolation gets them. The bookkeepers can't seem to understand that ranching doesn't follow the same rules as town business. But that's the practical answer. He paused, looked out the window where the sun was starting to build its daily argument with comfort. The real answer is, I'm 34 years old, and I'm tired of talking to horses. Despite everything, she laughed, a small sound but real. Do they not answer? Oh, they answer. But it's always the same thing. More oats. The woman with the child looked over, curiosity naked on her face. Wade ignored her, focused on Josephine, as if she were a mathematical problem he was working out. Your turn, he said. Why'd you answer that advertisement? Really, she could have given him the surface answer. Poverty, desperation, lack of options. But he'd been honest, so she reached for the same. My mother died when I was 19. Consumption, same as took my father eventually. But she went slow, had time to talk. One night near the end, she told me she'd never been more than 40 miles from where she was born. 40 miles her whole life. She said. Josephine stopped, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. She said I should go far enough to become someone new, if the someone I wasn't enough. Is that what you're looking for? To become someone new, I'm looking to become someone, period. Not someone's daughter, not someone's burden, not someone's obligation. Just someone. He nodded slowly. That's a better reason than most. They finished breakfast in companionable quiet. Around them, the boarding house went about its morning dishes, clattering doors, opening and closing voices, discussing weather and prices, and who was seen with whom. But at their table, a bubble of calm held, as if they'd agreed to a temporary truce with the urgency of decision. When he stood, he moved with the economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. Horses are outside when you're ready. No rush. She found him 10 minutes later, holding the reins of 2 horses, a bay mare, with a white blaze down her face, and a larger roan gelding that kept tossing its head as if arguing with the bit. This is Patience, he said, indicating the mare. She's got more sense than most people and a smoother gait than you'd expect. You said you could ride. I said I could ride when I was younger. It's been 8 years. Like swimming. Body remembers even when the mind forgets. He offered his cupped hands for her to mount, and she accepted the boost, trying not to think about the brief pressure of his shoulder against her knee as she swung into the saddle. The mare stood solid, Patient as her name. They rode out past the last building, past the cemetery, where wooden crosses stood at angles that suggested the ground itself was unsettled, past the schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays. The land opened up like a book written in languages. She didn't know bunch grass, mesquite, prickly pear, spreading its flat hands toward the Sunday. How far is your ranch? She asked. 5 miles north, but the land starts about a mile out. I've got 4,000 acres. Though only about half is any good for grazing. 4,000 acres. In Boston, she'd lived in 3 rooms above the shop. The vastness of it pressed against her chest. They rode in silence for a while, the horses' hooves creating a rhythm that became meditative. The heat was building, but not yet cruel, and there was a breeze that carried the scent of something herbal, sage maybe, or something cousin to it. A jackrabbit burst from cover, bounded away in gravity-defying leaps. The mare didn't even flick an ear. There, Wade said finally, pointing to a low ridge. That's the southern boundary. They crested the rise, and Broken Spur Ranch spread before her like a promise that had been kept despite odds. The house sat solid and square, 2 stories of wood and stone that looked like they'd grown from the ground rather than been built on it. A barn the color of dried blood, a bunkhouse with laundry flapping on a line, corrals where horses moved like shadows on water. And to the east, surprising as rain, a small orchard, maybe 24 trees, standing in neat rows, their leaves green, despite the drought she could see in the brown grass everywhere else. "You built this." Not really a question, more an acknowledgement. "My father started it. I've added on." The orchard was my mother's project. She hauled water by hand the first 2 years, until the trees found their own way to water. A man emerged from the barn, young, maybe 20, with hair so blonde it was almost white, and a way of moving that suggested he'd learned to be comfortable in his own body early. "Boss," he called, then saw Josephine, and pulled his hat off fast enough to mess his hair. "Ma'am, Daniel, this is Miss Ali. She's visiting. Might be staying on." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, but he just nodded. "Welcome, ma'am. You need anything, you just holler." "How many hands do you have?" she asked Wade, as they dismounted. 4 full-time, including Daniel. More during roundup and branding. Good men, mostly. Couple rough ones, but they work hard and don't cause trouble in town. He led her to the house-up wooden steps that had been swept clean recently. She could see the broom marks in the dust. The front door was solid oak, unexpected luxury here, with glass panels on either side that let light into the entrance hall. Inside, the house revealed itself slowly. The front room was large, dominated by a stone fireplace that had seen use beyond just warmth. She could see where a pothook still hung. The furniture was minimal but well made. A leather sofa that had shaped itself to bodies over time, 2 chairs that didn't match but seemed to get along, a low table marked with rings from cups set down without thought to coasters. But it was the books that stopped her. One whole wall was shelves floor to ceiling, filled with volumes that had been read, not just displayed. She moved closer, reading spines, Shakespeare, Emerson, agricultural manuals, novels she recognized, and some she didn't even what looked like a Greek lexicon. "My mother was a teacher before she married," Wade said from behind her. "Back in Ohio. She brought the books with her, said they were her dowry. My father built her these shelves before he built anything else in the house. She taught you everything that mattered. Reading, writing, arithmetic, how to think before you speak, how to apologize when you don't, how to make bread that doesn't taste like punishment." The kitchen was large and practical. A massive iron stove, a table that could seat 8 shelves of dishes that were plain but whole. Everything was clean but not fussy, as if someone had tidied for company but hadn't tried to pretend life didn't happen here. "The stove takes some getting used to," he said. "It runs hot on the left side, barely warm on the right. But once you learn its moods, it behaves." Upstairs, he showed her 4 bedrooms. His was clearly the one at the front. She could see through the open door to a bed that was made but not perfectly a shirt, hanging on a peg, boots lined up like soldiers. The other 3 were waiting furniture covered with sheets, windows letting in light that fell on empty floors. The last room at the back had been his mother's sewing room. A machine sat under a dust cover, and there were shelves of fabric thread patterns. A dress form stood in the corner like a ghost waiting for flesh. "She made most of our clothes," he said quietly. "Said it was cheaper than buying, but I think she just liked having something that was hers, something that couldn't be argued with by weather or cattle prices." Back on the porch, they sat in chairs that had learned the shapes of bodies over years. The view stretched to mountains that were more suggestion than solid purple-blue in the distance. A hawk circled high up, patient. "I won't lie to you," Wade said. "It's hard living. Summer's brutal, winter's worse in its own way. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles, town is 5. You can go weeks without seeing another woman. The work never stops. There's always something broken, something sick, something needing tending. But it's real. What you build stays built unless nature has other ideas. The money you earn is yours, not some banker's in a city you'll never see. The beef you eat, you raised. The vegetables you grow taste like effort and rain when it finally comes." He turned to look at her directly. "And you'd have a say in all of it. Your name on the deed, your word carrying weight. Partners. Not me giving orders, and you taking them. Why would you do that? Give a stranger that much power, because a partnership where one person holds all the cards isn't a partnership. It's an employment. And because he stopped, seemed to reconsider, then continued. Because I saw you yesterday standing in that street with your world collapsed around you. And you didn't cry. You didn't beg. You didn't take the easy money and run. You stood there and made a choice. That's the kind of strength this life needs. A woman came around the corner of the house, Mexican, maybe 40, with black hair streaked with silver and hands that moved like birds as she talked. Senor Wade, you bring a guest, and don't tell me, how am I supposed to? She stopped when she saw Josephine, and her face went through several expressions before settling on carefully pleased. Ah, you are the lady from town. Welcome. Josephine, this is Rosa Hernandez. She keeps us from starving and from living like animals. I keep them from killing each other with their cooking, Rosa corrected. Last month, Daniel tried to make stew. I think it's still alive in the pot growing stronger. It wasn't that bad, Daniel protested, appearing from the barn. The dog wouldn't eat it. We don't have a dog. Exactly. It ran away after tasting his stew. Despite everything, Josephine found herself laughing. It felt strange, like using a muscle that had atrophied. These people were bantering as if the world hadn't shifted off its axis yesterday, as if life could continue being normal even when nothing was normal at all. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, cold beef bread that Rosa had obviously made that morning, tomatoes from a garden Josephine could see through the back window. The men talked about fence repairs needed on the north pasture, a horse that had come up lame, the possibility of rain that everyone could feel but nobody believed. Josephine listened, watching how they interacted. Wade led without loudness, asking questions more than giving orders. Daniel was eager, maybe a little in love with the romance of ranch life. Two other men came in, Miguel, who was Rosa's husband, solid and quiet, with hands that could probably fix anything, and Tom, younger, with the kind of restlessness that suggested he wouldn't stay long. Miss Ali keeps books, Wade said at one point. She's going to look at our ledgers, see if we're as broke as I think we are. We're broker, Miguel said matter-of-factly, but the cattle are fat, and the grass will come back. Always does. After lunch, Wade took her to his office, a small room off the main house. That was obviously where paperwork went to die. Ledgers were stacked on every surface, receipts shoved into boxes, correspondence that had probably needed answering months ago. I warned you, he said, looking almost embarrassed. She picked up the nearest ledger, opened it. His handwriting was clear, but his bookkeeping was creative at best. Numbers appeared and disappeared without explanation, dates were suggestions, and she was fairly certain he'd been using some sort of personal code that made sense only to him. This is, she started, then stopped trying to be diplomatic. A disaster. You can say it. It's salvageable. But it needs a complete overhaul. You're losing money not because you don't have it, but because you don't know where it is. Could you fix it? Yes. But it would take time. And I'd need complete access authority to question expenses and make changes. Done. Just like that, Miss Ali. Josephine, I know cattle. I know grass and water and which horse is going to go lame before it does. I don't know numbers beyond what I can count on my fingers. If you can make those books make sense, you'd be worth your weight in gold. Hell, worth your weight in water, which out here is worth more. They sat in that dusty office, papers between them like tea leaves that might tell the future, and she felt something she hadn't expected, possibility. Not romantic, not yet, but the possibility of purpose, of being necessary for more than just ornament, or children, or keeping a house that was already kept. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would. We marry legally, but the marriage itself, the physical part, that waits until we both agree to it. No forcing, no assuming, no guilt about duty. Agreed. My name goes on the deed as equal partner. Agreed. I have equal say in financial decisions. Agreed. If after 1 year we find we don't suit, we divorce civilly. You keep the ranch, but I get a settlement enough to start over elsewhere. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair. But I have a condition too. Yes, you give it a real chance. Don't keep one foot out the door. For 1 year, try to make this home. Really try. After that, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. But for 1 year, be here completely." She looked out the window where the orchard stood green against all that brown proof that things could grow in unlikely soil if someone was willing to haul water. "Yes," she said. 1 year completely. He held out his hand. She took it, calluses meeting the softer skin of someone who'd worked with pen more than rope. But both kinds of work left marks, and maybe that was enough common ground to start with. The wedding, such as it was, took place 3 days later. Just enough time for gossip to exhaust itself with speculation, and for Josephine to alter one of Wade's mother's dresses, a green cotton that had been stored in lavender and cedar, protected from time, if not from memory. "She would have liked you," Rosa said, helping with the hemming. They sat in what had been the sewing room afternoon light, making the thread shine like spider silk. She had the same way of looking at things, straight on, no flinching. What was she like? Strong. Not loud, strong, quiet strong. Like water that wears down rock. She came here when there was nothing, just Wade's father and dreams and debt. She made it into something. Rosa's fingers moved quick, and sure, decades of practice in them. "She taught me English. I taught her to cook with what grows here instead of trying to make Ohio food in Texas heat. We were friends. What happened to her fever? It came fast. Monday she was preserving peaches. Thursday she was gone. Senor Wade was out with the herd. By the time he got back, she was already buried. The men did it. They thought they were helping, not making him miss his goodbye." Josephine thought of her own mother those last weeks that seemed endless at the time but now felt brief as a held breath. At least she'd had her goodbyes, inadequate as they'd been. The wedding itself was held at the ranch in the main room, with its book-lined walls and morning light. Reverend Johnson came from town along with Mrs. Grayson and a handful of others, the shopkeeper and his wife, the blacksmith, the school teacher, who looked at the books with the hunger of someone who'd been living on McGuffey readers, and whatever stories she could remember. Wade wore a black suit that had obviously been his father's, taken in to fit. He looked uncomfortable in it, like a horse wearing a hat, possible but not advisable. But he stood straight, and when Josephine came down the stairs in the green dress, his face did something she couldn't quite read, surprise maybe, or recognition, as if he'd been waiting to see who she really was. And now he knew. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Johnson had learned not to test the patience of people who had work waiting. The vows were standard, except for one moment, when Wade said to have and to hold, and paused, looking directly at her, then added quietly, "When you're ready for holding." A few people heard. "Mrs." Grayson smiled behind her handkerchief. Rosa nodded approval. Even Daniel, standing as witness, looked away, as if he'd seen something private that gave him hope about the nature of romance. The ring was his mother's, plain gold, worn thin in places from years of work. It fit without adjustment, as if her hands and Josephine's had been shaped by similar forces. After there was a meal in the yard tables made of planks on Sawhorse's food, that everyone had contributed something to Daniel, playing fiddle with more enthusiasm than skill. The nearest neighbors had come, the Brennans from the Double K, the Washburns from the Circle T, bringing children who ran wild as soon as they were released from church clothes. "It's good to see the Broken Spur having a party again," Mrs. Brennan told Josephine. She was a comfortable woman, soft in the way of someone who'd had children, and decided her body had earned the right to relax. "Wade's been alone too long. Man gets strange when he only talks to cattle. How long have you known him? Since he was 10, and his family first came here. Even then he was serious old soul, my mother would have said. But his mother could make him laugh." I hope she stopped, then seemed to decide Josephine could take directness. "I hope you can make him laugh too. He deserves some lightness." As the sun started its descent, painting everything gold, then orange, then red, the guests began leaving. Wagons loaded with sleepy children, horses saddled for the ride home, everyone taking some piece of leftover food because waste was a sin nobody here could afford. Finally, it was just the regular inhabitants of Broken Spur cleaning up in the fading light. Josephine worked alongside Rosa, wrapping food, washing dishes, not talking about the fact that this was her wedding night, and everyone knew what was supposed to happen but wouldn't. When the last dish was dried, Rosa hugged her quick, fierce. "You are good for this place," she said. "Already I can see it." The house knows a woman is here again. Wade was on the porch when Josephine finally went looking for him, chair tipped back, watching stars emerge like secrets being told one at a time. Tired, he asked. Exhausted, she admitted, sitting in the other chair. Her feet hurt from boots she wasn't used to. Her face hurt from smiling at strangers. Everything hurt from holding herself in the posture of bride all day. You did well. People liked you. People were curious about me. There's a difference. Not out here. Curiosity is the first step to acceptance. They have to know you're real before they can decide you're worthwhile. They sat quiet for a while, listening to the night sounds, something howling far off, probably coyotes, the horses settling in the barn, Rosa and Miguel's quiet voices from their cabin behind the main house. I put your things in the back bedroom, Wade said finally. The one with the eastern window. Gets good morning light, but stays cool in the afternoon. If you'd prefer a different room, it's fine. She appreciated that he'd chosen the room farthest from his, without making her ask. Thank you. No need to thank me for keeping my word. In my experience, keeping your word is exactly the thing that deserves thanks. He looked at her, then really looked, and she saw something shift in his expression, understanding maybe of just how many broken words had led her here. Josephine, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something being decided. This is strange for both of us. But strange doesn't mean wrong. We'll figure it out as we go. Yes, she agreed. As we go. The first month of marriage passed like a fever dream, everything too bright, too sharp, too real. Josephine learned the rhythm of the ranch the way she'd once learned Latin declensions, through repetition mistake and stubborn refusal to quit. Mornings began before the sun had any business being awake. She'd hear Wade's boots on the stairs, careful on the third step that creaked like a confession. By the time she dressed and made it to the kitchen, he'd have coffee going strong enough to wake the dead, as Rosa said, though she said it with approval. You don't have to get up with me, he told her. The fourth morning, finding her at the stove, attempting to make biscuits from Rosa's recipe. I'm not getting up with you, she said, wrestling with dough that seemed to have its own opinions about shape. I'm getting up for the books. They're less alarming in the morning light. That was partly true. The ledgers were a disaster that would take months to untangle. But the real truth was that she couldn't sleep past dawn anyway. The silence of the ranch at night was so different from Boston's constant noise that it kept her awake, and Wade's presence in the house, knowing he was just down the hall, just beyond a door she'd promised not to open until ready, created a tension that made rest impossible. The biscuits, burned on one side, stayed raw on the other. Wade ate them anyway, with enough butter to mask the worst of it. These are. He started, then stopped, searching for honesty that wouldn't wound. Terrible. You can say it. I was going to say ambitious. But terrible works too. She laughed, surprising them both. Rosa's going to ban me from the kitchen. Rosa's going to teach you if you let her. She taught my mother, and my mother couldn't boil water when she first came here. That afternoon, Rosa did exactly that. They stood side by side at the big stove, Rosa's hands guiding Josephine's through the mysteries of bread that would rise in dry heat, beans that would soften despite the alkaline water, meat that would stay tender even when cooked, within an inch of its life. The secret, Rosa said, is to stop fighting the place. You're trying to make Boston food in Texas. Make Texas food instead. I don't know what that means. It means use what grows here. Stop trying to make things be what they're not. The advice felt larger than cooking, but Josephine filed it away to think about later. Evenings were the hardest. After supper, when the work was done and the ranch settled into quiet, she and Wade would sit on the porch or in the main room, trying to learn how to be married without being intimate. They talked about safe things, cattle prices, weather predictions, which fence needed mending first. Sometimes she read aloud from one of his mother's books while he cleaned tack or mended harness. One night, about 3 weeks in, she was reading Emerson when he interrupted. Do you miss it, Boston? She set the book down. I miss knowing where I fit. I miss walking down a street and knowing every building, every face. I miss, she stopped, surprised by what she was about to say. What I miss having a future I could picture. Even when things were bad, I could imagine next week, next month. Here I can't see past tomorrow. Is that bad? she considered. "I don't know yet. Ask me in a year." He smiled, that small lift of his mouth she was beginning to recognize as genuine pleasure. Fair enough. The next morning she found a map on the kitchen table, hand-drawn in Wade's careful writing. It showed the ranch with every building, every pasture, every water source labeled. At the bottom he'd written, "So you can picture it." That small kindness undid something in her chest, a knot she hadn't known was there. Daniel became her unexpected ally in learning the ranch. The young man had a gift for explaining things without condescension, showing her how to read the sky for weather, the grass for grazing quality, the cattle for health. "See how that one's standing apart," he said one afternoon, pointing to a cow at the edge of the herd. "She's either sick or about to calve. The way she's holding her tail, I'd say calving. How can you tell from here? Same way you can probably look at a ledger and know something's off before you find the error. You learn the patterns, then you notice what doesn't fit." She liked the idea that all skills were really about pattern recognition, whether numbers or cattle. The conflict with the Porters simmered like a pot about to boil over. Miranda had taken to visiting the ranch when Wade was away, arriving in her fancy buggy with her silk parasol and her smile sharp as glass. "I thought I'd welcome you properly," she said, the first time standing on the porch like she owned it. "Woman to woman." "That's kind of you," Josephine replied, not opening the door wider. "It must be so difficult adjusting to this rustic life. So different from what you expected." "Different isn't always worse." "No, but it often is." Miranda's eyes traveled over Josephine's work dress, her hands already showing calluses, her hair pinned practically rather than fashionably. "I do hope Wade explained about the water rights." "What about them?" "Oh, didn't he tell you? The Broken Spur's water comes from a spring on the old Patterson place. The rights are complex. Edwin's been researching the legal precedents. Such fascinating reading." She left, then message delivered, poison planted. When Wade came home, Josephine asked him directly, "Is there a problem with the water rights?" His face darkened. "Miranda been here. Answer the question. The rights are solid. My father filed the claims properly 20 years ago. The Porters are fishing, looking for a weakness that isn't there. And if they find one, then we fight it, together." He said the last word carefully, like he was testing its weight. That's what partnership means. That night, she went through every document in his office, looking for anything about water rights. She found the claims filed properly, as he'd said, but also found correspondence from a lawyer in Austin, warnings about challenges to old claims, mentions of legal fees Wade couldn't afford. She made notes, began composing letters to lawyers she'd known in Boston, people who might know people who could help. She didn't tell Wade, not yet, but she'd learned that protection came in many forms. And sometimes the best defense was paperwork filed before anyone knew there was a fight. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke on a Tuesday that started peaceful as Sunday. Josephine was in the garden, learning from Rosa how to coax tomatoes from soil that seemed to resent vegetation when Daniel came riding hard from town. "Mrs. Sullivan." He swung down before his horse had fully stopped. "You need to see this." He handed her a folded paper, official looking, with a seal that meant government and trouble. She read it quickly, then again, slowly, her mind translating the legal language into plain truth. "Get Wade," she told Daniel. "Now." She found Rosa. "I need Miguel to saddle 2 horses and pack food for a day's ride. What's happened? The Porters have filed a claim disputing our water rights. We have 3 days to respond or lose access by default." Rosa cursed in Spanish, creative and extensive. "Those serpientes." They waited until Senor Wade was at the far pasture. Wade arrived an hour later, dust-covered and tight-jawed. He read the document, his face getting stonier with each word. "They're claiming prior use," he said, saying Porter's uncle had a verbal agreement with Patterson before my father filed. "Verbal agreements don't hold against filed claims. They do if they can produce witnesses. And the Porters have been spreading money around town like seed. Amazing what people remember when their debts get paid." Josephine stood. "Then we go to Austin. Today. Austin's 3 days' ride. The deadline is why we leave now. I can file a response, But I need access to the records office, and I need a lawyer who won't be bought. She was already moving, already planning. Rosa, can you pack clothes for 3 days? Daniel, we'll need the good horses, not the gentle ones. Wade, get whatever documents you have about the original claim, any correspondence with Patterson, anything that shows date of possession. Wade caught her arm gently. Josephine, this isn't your fight. My name's on the deed now, too. That makes it exactly my fight. She met his eyes. Besides, I'm better at this kind of battle than you are. Let me do what I'm good at. They rode out 2 hours later, pushing harder than was wise in the heat. Wade had argued for waiting until morning, starting fresh, but Josephine understood something he didn't. Legal battles were won by whoever filed first, filed most, filed with the most precision. 3 days was already almost too late. They stopped only when the horses demanded it, eating cold biscuits in the saddle, drinking water warm from canteens. The landscape blurred past scrub and stone and endless sky. By nightfall, they'd covered 30 miles, camping rough by a stream that was more suggestion than water. You're not what I expected, Wade said, watching her build a fire with the efficiency she'd brought to everything. When you stepped off that stage, I thought, you thought, city woman, delicate, probably useless. I thought, survivor. But I didn't know you were also a fighter. Same thing, just different tactics. She fed the small fire carefully. In Boston, I fought with ledgers and carefully worded letters. Here, apparently, I fight with horses and legal documents. Most women would have taken Porter's money and gone home. Home to what? An empty building and a life measured in other people's charity. She shook her head. That's not home. That's just geography. They reached Austin late on the second day, horses, lathered, both of them swaying with exhaustion. The city seemed impossibly large, after redemption buildings climbing 3-4-story streets full of carriages and purpose. Josephine felt something in her chest ease at the familiar noise of civilization, then immediately felt guilty for it. There, she said, pointing to a hotel that looked respectable but not fancy. We need rest and clean clothes before we face lawyers. The desk clerk looked at them skeptically. Dust-covered, exhausted. Clearly not the usual clientele, but Wade's money was good, and Josephine's Eastern accent still carried authority when she deployed it. In her room, she washed with water that came from pipes, dressed in her good dress that Rosa had packed, and transformed herself back into the woman who'd kept books and fought creditors. Looking in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. When had her face gotten sun-lined? When had her hands become so capable-looking? Wade knocked. When she opened the door, he'd transformed, too clean-shaven, wearing his father's suit again, looking uncomfortable but determined. Ready, he asked. No. But that's never stopped me before. The records office was a maze of filing cabinets and dust motes, presided over by a clerk who looked like he'd been pressed and dried along with the documents. Josephine deployed her Boston manners like weapons, getting access to files that should have taken weeks to retrieve. Here, she said, finally finding what she needed, the original Patterson claim. And here, look at the date. Wade's father filed his water rights claim 2 months before Porter's uncle even arrived in Texas. That's not what their witnesses will say. Witnesses can say anything. Documents don't lie. She made copies, her hand cramping from writing, but each word was a bullet they'd fire in court if needed. The lawyer they found was named Harrison Young, hungry with the kind of ambition that hadn't yet been corrupted by comfort. The Porters have influence, he warned. Judges listen to them. Judges listen to law, Josephine corrected. And the law is clear. First to file, first in right. Everything else is theater. Harrison looked at her with surprise, and something like respect. You've done this before. Different court, same game. They filed the response with an hour to spare, along with a countersuit Josephine had composed, alleging harassment and attempted theft by fraud. Harrison whistled when he read it. This is aggressive. They'll come at you twice as hard. Good, Wade said, speaking for the first time in the legal office. I'm tired of playing defense on my own land. The ride home was slower exhaustion, making them careful. They stopped at the same stream, built the same fire, but something had changed. They'd fought together, won the first skirmish together. It created an intimacy different from physical, the intimacy of shared purpose. Thank you, Wade said simply. It's not over. They'll respond probably with something dirtier. I know. But today we won. That's enough for today. She looked at him across the fire, this man who'd offered her choice, when the world had offered only defeat, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the foundation love might build on. They arrived back at Broken Spur to find chaos. Half the cattle were scattered fences cut on the north pasture, and Miguel sporting a black eye that told its own story. Porter's men came in the night. Daniel explained his usual easy manner, replaced by cold anger, said they were checking their property lines. When Miguel told them to leave, they suggested he might be confused about boundaries. How many cattle lost? Wade's voice was deadly quiet. Maybe 30 head. Tom and I tracked them toward the Porter's land, but... Daniel shrugged helplessly. Can't prove anything. Josephine felt rage rise in her throat like bile. In Boston, enemies had been subtle missed payments, whispered rumors, social cuts. This was blatant, violent, intended to break not just business, but spirit. We can't let this stand, she said. Can't prove it was them, Wade replied, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the porch rail. Then we prove something else. She went inside, came back with paper and pen. Daniel, I need you to remember exactly what the men looked like. Miguel the same. Every detail, height, horses, voices, scars, anything. Why? Because men who cut fences in darkness have usually done other things in daylight. We find out who they are, we find their histories. It took a week of careful investigation, Josephine writing letters, Rosa listening to gossip in town, Daniel drinking at the saloon and playing dumber than he was. They pieced together identities, 2 men who'd been run out of Amarillo for rustling, one who'd done time in Huntsville for assault, all now mysteriously employed by Edwin Porter. It's not enough for court, Harrison wrote when Josephine sent him the information. It's enough for conscience, she wrote back. And sometimes that's stronger. The Sunday after Josephine did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She put on her best dress, the one she'd been married in, and went to church. Wade tried to come with her, but she stopped him. This is something I need to do alone. The church was full. It always was. Entertainment being scarce and salvation being free. The Porters sat in their usual pew veranda, resplendent in yellow silk that cost more than most families saw in a year. Josephine took a seat directly behind them. Reverend Johnson preached about honesty, about neighbors, about the sin of false witness. Standard fare until Josephine stood during the time for testimonials. I'd like to share a story, she said, her Boston accent deliberately thick, deliberately different, about the kindness of strangers and the cruelty of those who should know better. The church went silent. Miranda turned, her face flushing. I came to this town with nothing but hope and promises. When those promises were broken, this community could have let me fail. Instead, Mr. Sullivan offered me dignity. Mrs. Grayson offered me shelter. Rosa Hernandez offered me knowledge. This town offered me a chance to belong. She paused, letting the words settle. But some people seem to think belonging is something that can be bought, sold, or stolen. They think water can be claimed with lies, that cattle can be scattered in darkness, that fear can drive out those who stand in their way. This is hardly appropriate, Edwin started, but Reverend Johnson raised a hand. Let her speak. I don't name names, Josephine continued, looking directly at Miranda now. That would be gossip, and gossip is a sin. But I do want to say that those who live in glass houses should be careful about throwing stones, and those who employ criminals should remember that criminals have no loyalty except to the highest bidder. She sat down. The silence was so thick you could spread it on bread. Then from the back someone started clapping. Old Mr. Brennan from the Double K, who'd lost cattle to mysterious circumstances last year. Then Mrs. Washington, whose well had gone dry after a dispute with the Porters. One by one, quiet applause rippled through the church, not overwhelming but enough. The Porters left before the final hymn. That evening, Wade found her in the garden pulling weeds with unnecessary violence. That was risky, he said. That was necessary. She yanked a particularly stubborn weed, satisfied when it came up, roots and all. They want to fight dirty fine, but they don't get to do it in shadow. You might have made things worse, or I might have reminded the town that they're not the only ones the Porters have hurt. She stood brushing dirt from her skirt. "Wade, I know you prefer direct action, but sometimes the indirect route is more effective." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're not who I expected to marry." The words stung until he continued, "You're more. You're so much more than I had any right to hope for." That night she lay in her bed still alone, and thought about the look on his face when he'd said those words. She thought about the way he'd stood behind her at church, not intervening but ready to, if needed. She thought about partnership and trust, and the way his hands looked when he worked, capable, careful, kind. She rose, walked down the hall, raised her hand to knock on his door, stood there for a full minute, heart hammering, then turned away. Not yet, but soon. The attack came 2 weeks later, legal rather than physical, but devastating in its precision. The Porters had found a judge in Austin, Judge Mathis, who owed his appointment to Miranda's late husband's connections. He issued an injunction freezing the Broken Spur's water rights pending a full hearing. "They can't do that," Daniel protested, reading the document over Wade's shoulder. "They just did," Wade replied flatly. "Without water rights, they couldn't water the cattle." In July in Texas, that was a death sentence. "How long before the hearing?" Josephine asked. 6 weeks. "The cattle won't last 6 weeks. That's the point." They sat around the kitchen table, Wade, Josephine, Daniel, Miguel, Rosa, like a war council planning for siege. "We could drive the cattle north," Miguel suggested. "The Brennans might let us use their water." "They're already stretched thin," Wade replied. "And moving the herd in this heat will kill the weak ones." "We could dig new wells," Daniel offered. "With what money we're already stretched from paying Harrison." Josephine stood abruptly. "I need to think." She walked out, leaving them to their increasingly desperate plans. She found herself in Wade's office, staring at the ledgers she'd spent months organizing. All that work, all that careful planning, undone by one corrupt judge. In Boston, she would have known what to do, which clerk to bribe, which official to petition. Here she was fighting on unfamiliar ground with unfamiliar weapons. Or was she? She pulled out paper, began writing. A letter to Boston to Mr. Hartwell, her father's old lawyer who'd handled the estate. Another to Mrs. Beacon, who ran the ladies' auxiliary and knew everyone worth knowing. A third to Jonathan Morrison, a reporter who'd courted her briefly and still sent occasional letters. 3 days later, she rode to town alone, despite Wade's protests. She sent telegrams, expensive ones, lengthy ones that would raise eyebrows at the telegraph office. Then she waited. The response came faster than expected. Jonathan Morrison's newspaper was interested, very interested, in a story about Eastern investors being swindled by corrupt Western judges. Mrs. Beacon knew someone who sat on the Railroad Commission. Mr. Hartwell had a colleague who specialized in water rights and loved nothing more than embarrassing provincial judges. "What are you planning?" Wade asked, finding her surrounded by telegrams and letters. "I'm changing the battlefield." She showed him Morrison's response. "The Porters think this is a local fight." But Miranda's late husband had investors in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Those investors get nervous when they hear about corruption. Nervous investors ask questions. Questions lead to investigation. That could take months. Or it could take one story in the right newspaper suggesting that Texas justice can be bought by whoever has the deepest pockets. The railroad needs Eastern investment. The governor needs railroad support. Judge Mathis needs the governor's favor. She smiled, sharp as Miranda's had ever been. "It's all connected if you know which strings to pull." The story ran a week later. Not front page, but prominent enough. Questions arise about Texas water rights decision. It mentioned no names directly, but included enough details that anyone paying attention would know exactly which judge and which case. 2 days after that, Judge Mathis reconsidered the injunction. A week later, it was lifted entirely. How Wade asked, staring at the official notice. "I reminded certain people that their money was only as safe as the legal system protecting it. Corruption that helps them today could hurt them tomorrow. Better to maintain the fiction of impartial justice." He looked at her with something like awe. "You fought the entire system." "No, I used one part of the system against another. It's what I learned in Boston. Power isn't about strength. It's about leverage. That night, for the first time since they'd married, Wade came to her room. He knocked, waited for permission, entered carefully. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "not just for saving the ranch, but for showing me there are different kinds of courage." "Wade, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that I see you, really see you. Not as someone who needed rescue, not as a solution to my problems, but as you, Josephine, who you really are." She stood from where she'd been sitting at the small desk, walked to him slowly. "And who am I? Someone stronger than circumstances. Someone who builds instead of breaks. Someone who," he stopped, swallowed. "Someone I'm falling in love with, if that's allowed." "It's allowed," she whispered, and raised her hand to his face. He caught her hand, held it against his cheek for a moment, then stepped back. "But not required. Not part of our bargain. Wade." She said his name like a decision. "Our bargain was for a year. It's been 4 months. I know. I don't need 8 more months." His eyes searched hers. "What do you need?" "You," she said simply. "Just you." This time when he kissed her, it wasn't gentle or careful. It was 4 months of waiting, of watching, of wanting. It was partnership becoming something deeper, trust becoming love. When he pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "Your room or mine?" he asked. "Ours," she answered, and led him down the hall to the master bedroom that had been waiting like everything else on this ranch for the right moment to come alive again. 6 months later. January 1876. The norther came howling down from the plains like all the demons of winter ice in its teeth and murder in its intent. Josephine had thought she knew cold from Boston winters, but this was different. This was cold with nowhere to hide cold, that found every crack in the walls, and laughed at human presumption. "Get the cattle to the eastern hollow," Wade shouted to the men, his words nearly lost in the wind, "and bring the horses into the barn, all of them." They'd been preparing for days since Daniel spotted the signs: birds flying, wrong cattle bunching, nervous, the air itself feeling like held breath. But knowing a storm is coming and surviving it are different things. Josephine worked beside Rosa boarding windows, using precious nails to hold blankets over gaps. Her fingers went numb in minutes, but she kept moving. In the months since she'd become Wade's wife, in truth as well as law, she'd learned that ranch life didn't pause for weather or comfort. Inside both of you, Wade ordered, appearing like a ghost from the white. Ice crusted his eyebrows, made him look ancient. "Miguel and I will finish." The chickens Rosa started, already done. Daniel's got them in the feed shed. Inside the house felt like a fortress under siege. Wind screamed around corners, found harmonies in the chimney that sounded like grief. They built the fire-high-pulled mattresses down to the main room, created a cave of warmth in the growing cold. "How long?" Josephine asked. 2 days, maybe 3. Wade pulled her against him, and she felt him shivering through layers of wool. Maybe longer. They survived on coffee and beans, on stories told to pass time while wind tried to tear the roof off. Rosa taught Josephine Spanish curse words. Miguel told tales of worse storms, though everyone knew he was lying. Daniel played his fiddle until a string snapped from cold, the sound like a gunshot in the close room. On the second night, the wind died to merely vicious, and Wade ventured out to check the animals. He came back grim. Lost 2 cows. Maybe more, can't see them all in the drift. "But most survived?" Josephine asked. "Most. Then we survived." He looked at her hair, wild from 3 days without proper washing, face smudged with smoke from the constantly fed fire, wearing one of his shirts over her dress for warmth, and smiled. "Yes," he said, "we survived." When the storm finally broke, the world had been remade in white and silence. Drifts reached the lower windows. The path to the barn had disappeared. But the sun came out brilliant and unrepentant, turning everything to crystal and possibility. They dug out slowly, all of them working together. The losses were bearable: 3 cattle, some chickens, part of the roof on the eastern side of the barn. It could have been so much worse. That night, finally warm and clean and fed properly, Josephine and Wade lay in their bed. their bed now broken in by 6 months of learning each other's bodies like territory to be mapped with careful attention. "I would have lost half the herd without you," he said, into the darkness. "What do you mean?" "The ledgers. You showed me we could afford extra feed. I bought it grudging the expense, but it meant we could keep them close-fed, sheltered. Previous winters, I let them range free, figured they'd survive or not based on strength." "Partnership," she said, finding his hand under the quilts. "Different strengths for different battles." Spring came tentative like a guest unsure of welcome. The ranch stirred back to life, calves dropping garden seeds, planted fences, mended from winter damage. Josephine stood on the porch one morning in April, watching Wade work with a new horse patient, and persistent, and realized she was happy. Not the fierce happiness of survival, or the giddy happiness of new love, but the deep, quiet happiness of belonging. The Porters had gone quiet after their legal defeat. Rumors said Edwin was having money troubles. Investors pulling out loans called in. Miranda was seen less in town, her silk dresses replaced by practical cotton, her buggy sold to cover debts. "I almost feel sorry for them," Josephine said to Rosa one day. "Don't," Rosa replied firmly. "Rattlesnakes don't become rabbits just because they're wounded." The warning proved prophetic. It started with smoke on the horizon, black and wrong against the May sky. Wade saw it first, standing sudden in the stirrups. "Fire," he said, and the word carried all the fear Texas knew. It was coming from the direction of town, but the wind was pushing it toward them. Already Josephine could smell it, not the clean smoke of hearth fires, but the angry smoke of destruction. "Get the firebreak cleared, Wade," ordered Daniel. "Miguel, start soaking the ground between here and the creek. Tom, get the horses moved north." "What can I do?" Josephine asked. "Pray for rain." But he gripped her hand once, quick and fierce, before riding toward the smoke to see how bad it was. He came back within the hour, face grim. "It's the Porter's place. Already jumped to the Washburn Ranch." "How did it start?" "Does it matter? It's coming." They worked through the day, creating a barrier of wet earth and cleared land. Every able body from 3 ranches joined them, former feuds forgotten in the face of common enemy. Even Judge Mathis's son showed up, working beside men his father had tried to ruin. The fire came at sunset, beautiful and terrible. It ate the prairie grass like a living thing, jumped the creek in places, sent embers flying like deadly stars. They fought it with water, with dirt, with blankets, soaked and swung. Josephine's hands blistered, her lungs burned, but she kept moving. Then, miracle or meteorology, the wind shifted, turned the fire back on itself into ground already burned. It stuttered, sparked, died to smoke and char. They stood in the aftermath, exhausted, victorious, black with soot. The broken spur had survived most of the neighboring ranches too. But the Porter place, gone, Edwin said, standing where his house had been. He looked older, smaller, like the fire had burned away everything that had made him formidable. All of it. Miranda sat in the dirt, her latest dress ruined, staring at nothing. For the first time since Josephine had met her, she looked human. Not cruel or calculating, just lost. "You'll stay with us," Wade said, and Josephine felt proud of him, even as she wondered at the wisdom. "Until you figure out what's next." "We couldn't," Edwin started, but there was no force behind it. "You could and you will," Rosa said, appearing with water and her particular brand of stern kindness. "No one sleeps outside after fighting fire together." They stayed 3 days. 3 surreal days of former enemies eating at the same table, sharing the same roof. Miranda barely spoke, the fight gone out of her like stuffing from a torn doll. Edwin made himself useful where he could, revealing unexpected skill with hammer and nail. On the 3rd night, he found Josephine alone on the porch. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly, "for the letters, for the promises, for all of it." She could have been cruel, could have twisted the knife of his loss. Instead, she said, "You gave me a gift, though you didn't mean to." "What gift?" "If you'd kept your word, I'd be your wife now. Comfortable, probably. Safe, certainly. But I wouldn't be." She gestured at the ranch, at the life she'd built. "I wouldn't be who I am now. Wade's lucky. We're both lucky. We found partnership instead of mere marriage." Edwin left the next morning, he and Miranda heading east to family she had in Louisiana. Before they left, Miranda approached Josephine. "I hated you," she said simply. "You had everything I thought I wanted, beauty, without effort, education, that Eastern polish. Then you got Wade, too." "I never had beauty without effort," Josephine replied. "And Wade was never yours to lose. I know that now. I knew it then, too, but knowing and accepting." Miranda shrugged. "I hope you're happy. I mean that." After they were gone, the ranch felt larger, somehow like a threat had been removed, that they'd grown so used to they'd forgotten its weight. That night, Wade pulled Josephine close in bed. "You were kind to them. Kicking broken people doesn't make you stronger. Some would. I'm not some." She turned in his arms to face him. "Wade, I need to tell you something." He went still, worry creasing his face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. But my monthly bleeding is late. Has been for 2 months now." The silence stretched. "Then you're pregnant." "I think so. Rosa thinks so. The symptoms fit." He pulled her closer, buried his face in her hair, and she felt him shaking. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Happy. He pulled back to look at her. "Josephine, I don't have words. My mother always said this house needed children's voices. I thought when she died that chance died too. Well, she said, trying for lightness through tears, prepare for voices. If this child inherits your stubbornness and my tendency to argue, we're in for noise." He laughed, kissed her, held her like she was made of spun glass. "No," she said, "none of that. I'm pregnant, not fragile. You're miraculous. I'm practical. We need to plan the room supplies, what happens to the ranch work when I can't." He silenced her with another kiss. "Tonight just let me be amazed." September 1876. The pains started at dawn, as if this child already understood the rhythm of ranch life, that everything important began when the sky turned from black to gray. Josephine had been expecting them for a week, her body heavy, and strange to her, the baby riding so low that even drawing breath felt like lifting stone. She'd woken each morning thinking today, only to have the sun set on another day of waiting. But when the first real contraction came tightening across her belly like a fist closing on iron, she still gasped at its intensity, how something her body did naturally could feel so foreign, so overwhelming. Wade, she managed her fingers, finding his shoulder in the pre-dawn darkness, gripping hard enough to leave marks. He came awake instantly, that sudden alertness, learned from years of midnight cattle emergencies, coyotes at the henhouse storms, that gave no warning. His hand covered hers immediately. Now, soon, another wave was building already, and she breathed through it the way Rosa had taught her counting in Spanish, because somehow the unfamiliar words required more concentration, gave her something to hold on to. He was up and dressed before she could even sit up properly, pulling on boots and shirt with the efficiency of crisis. "Rosa." His voice carried through the house, urgent but not panicked. "It's time." Then to Daniel, who slept in the lean-to during calving season, "Ride for Doc Hartman. Fast as you can, but don't kill the horse or yourself." Josephine heard the thunder of hooves departing even as Rosa bustled in her gray-streaked hair, already pinned for business arms full of clean linens that smelled of sunshine and lye soap. The older woman's face was calm, almost serene. She delivered more babies than Doc Hartman, probably, between her own 5 and half the ranch families in the county. "Out," Rosa commanded, pointing at Wade. "This is women's work. Now I'm not leaving her. You are. You'll pace the hall and pray, and stay out of my way." Rosa's tone brooked no argument, the same voice she used to command her kitchen kingdom. "Your job was 9 months ago. This is ours." Wade looked at Josephine, torn between obedience and protection. She managed to nod between contractions. "Go. I'll be fine." But she wasn't fine, not really. The labor stretched through the morning, each wave stronger than the last. The bedroom became a strange world unto itself. Curtains, drawn against the climbing sun, candles lit, despite the daylight, Rosa's quiet Spanish prayers mixing with Josephine's controlled breathing. She could hear Wade just outside the door, his boots wearing a track in the hallway boards. Once, she heard him arguing with Rosa in low, fierce tones. "At least let me see her. When there's something to see besides pain, you can see. Now go check your cattle, or something useful. Damn the cattle, Wade Sullivan, you blaspheme outside my birthing room again, and I'll bar you from this house entirely." Between contractions, when the world briefly made sense again, Josephine almost laughed. This man who faced down storms and rattlesnakes and corrupt judges was being thoroughly managed by a woman half his size. "Let him in," she said, during a brief respite when the pain had retreated enough for speech. Wade appeared instantly, as if he'd been pressed against the door. His face was tight with worry, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. He'd never looked younger to her or more lost. "What do you need? What can I do?" "Distraction," she gasped, as another wave began building. "Tell me about the cattle." So he did. Sat beside the bed, took her hand in both of his, and talked about the ordinary world that continued outside this room. His voice became her anchor, steady and familiar, while her body did this unfamiliar work. He told her about the red cow favoring her left front leg, probably from a stone bruise, how the grass was coming back, green and eager after the spring rains, like the earth was trying to make up for last year's drought, how Daniel had been sneaking looks at the new school teacher, Miss Catherine, and everyone pretended not to notice him washing his face extra careful on Sundays. "Miguel thinks we should expand the eastern pasture," he continued, rubbing his thumb across her knuckles as she gripped his hand through another contraction. "Says the soil there is better than it looks, just needs the right touch." Hours passed in this strange rhythm, pain and rest, Wade's voice and Rosa's competent hands, the sun moving across the floor in dusty golden bars. Josephine lost track of time, existed only in the moment, in breath and push and Wade's constant presence. When the baby finally came sliding into the world with a cry of pure indignation, it was full dark outside. The room smelled of sweat and blood, and the strange, sweet scent that accompanies new life. Rosa lifted the baby, still slick and furious, at the bright, cold world. "Un niño," Rosa announced, tears streaming down her weathered face. A healthy, loud boy. Wade made a sound Josephine had never heard from him, half sob, half laugh. Rosa placed the baby in his arms, and this man who could rope a calf at full gallop held his son like spun glass might break. The baby's cries softened to whimpers, then silence, as if he recognized something in his father's careful hands. Like his mother, Wade said, tears running unchecked down his sun-weathered cheeks, already arguing with the world about how things should be. They named him William Joseph. William after Wade's father, who'd built the ranch's foundation; Joseph after Josephine's father, who'd given her the courage to seek new horizons even in his absence. The baby was perfect and terrifying, this small life they'd created, without instruction manual or guide, only love and determination. 3 nights later, exhausted from the constant cycle of feeding and changing and worrying, Josephine sat in the rocking chair Wade had carved while she was pregnant. William fussed in her arms. Neither hungry nor wet, just unsettled in the way babies are when the world is too big and they're too small. "I don't know how to be a mother," she admitted to Wade, who was walking circuits around the room, taking his turn at soothing. "What if I do everything wrong? What if he grows up to hate the ranch, hate this life we've chosen for him?" Wade paused, looked at her with those steady blue eyes that had first offered her choice when the world had offered only defeat. "I don't know how to be a father either. My own was gone so much working himself into the grave to build this place. But look," he gestured to the room, to the ranch beyond, to the life they'd built. "We didn't know how to be married either, and we figured that out well enough." She smiled despite her exhaustion, remembering those first awkward months sleeping in separate rooms, learning each other like a new language. "We did, didn't we? And we'll figure this out too. Together. Same as everything else." William settled finally, milk-drunk and content, and they stood together at the window watching stars pierce through the Texas darkness. In 3 months, a letter would come from Boston, her sister Elizabeth writing of settled debts and unexpected inheritance, enough money to return to civilization if she chose. Josephine would read it aloud. To Wade, watch his face carefully, mask the fear of losing her, and she would choose this life again. Choose midnight feedings and cattle prices. Choose Rosa's wisdom and Daniel's music. Choose this man who'd offered her partnership when the world offered ownership. But tonight she didn't know any of that. Tonight she only knew the weight of her son in her arms, the solid warmth of Wade beside her, and the vast Texas night holding them all like a promise that some things once chosen become permanent, as stars fixed points by which to navigate whatever storms might come. Epilogue Redemption. Summer 1880. Mama, look what I found. William, 4 years old and fearless, came running with something clutched in his grubby fist. His sister Sarah, barely 2, toddled after him, determined not to be left behind. Josephine looked up from the ledgers, still her domain, though now she worked with William on her hip more often than not. Her son held out his treasure, a piece of blue glass, weathered smooth. "It's beautiful," she told him. "Where did you find it?" "By the old house. The burned one. Uncle Daniel says it was a bottle. The porterhouse." Even 4 years later, people still called it the burned place. The land had been sold for taxes, bought by the Brennans, but the foundation remained slowly being covered by prairie grass. Can I keep it, of course? But wash it first. Wade came in, then carrying Sarah, who had clearly been helping with the horses. She was covered in dust and delight. "We've got visitors coming." "Who, wagon from town?" "Looks like new folks." They watched from the porch as the wagon approached. A man-woman, 3 children. The woman was young, pretty in a tired way, holding the baby like she was afraid it might disappear. "Mr. Sullivan." The man climbed down, hat in hand. "I'm James Morrison. This is my wife, Anne. We heard. That is, in town they said you might have work." Josephine saw it then, the same desperation she'd worn 5 years ago, the look of people who'd traveled far on hope alone. "What kind of work can you do?" Wade asked. "Anything. Everything. I was a clerk in Chicago, but I can learn. I will learn. I can cook, so keep house," Anne added quietly. "And I'm good with numbers." Josephine and Wade exchanged glances. Daniel was talking about starting his own place. They'd need new hands soon. "The bunkhouse is full," Wade said slowly. "But there's the old foreman's cabin. Needs work, but it's sound." Hope flickered across James's face. "We're not afraid of work. Can you start tomorrow?" "We can start now." And they did. James learned cattle the way Josephine had once learned ranch life, through stubbornness and mistakes, and getting up each time he fell. Anne proved to be not just good with numbers, but brilliant taking over parts of the bookkeeping, so Josephine could focus on the growing business of selling horses to the army. One evening a year later, Josephine found Anne crying over the ledgers. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Everything. We were so lost when we came here. And now James is talking about buying our own land someday, and I'm teaching the school children arithmetic. And I can't believe this is our life." Josephine sat beside her, remembering her own tears over different ledgers in a different life. "I know that feeling. How did you do it? Come here alone, start over. I wasn't alone. I thought I was, but I wasn't. I had Wade and Rosa and this whole unlikely family we've built. Just like you're not alone now." Anne wiped her eyes. "The town gossips say you saved this ranch. The town gossips are wrong. This ranch saved me. Or rather, we saved each other." That night, after the children were asleep, and the house had settled into its comfortable creaking, Josephine and Wade sat on the porch as they did most evenings. The ranch spread before them, larger, now prosperous, but essentially the same place that had taken in a desperate woman 5 years ago. "Any regrets?" Wade asked their old ritual. "Only one," she said, their old response. "Still wish you'd come to my room sooner, no?" She smiled. "Now I wish I'd learned to make biscuits that don't break teeth." He laughed, pulled her closer. "Your biscuits are improving." "Liar. Your biscuits are still terrible, but you make excellent children." She elbowed him gently. "We make excellent children. That too." In the distance, a coyote called, answered by another. The sound that had once frightened her now seemed like punctuation, the land itself saying, "Yes, here, home." Tomorrow there would be work. There was always work. Cattle to tend horses, to train children, to raise books to balance. Sarah would try to follow William into some adventure. The new foal would need checking. Anne would need help with the school supplies order. But tonight, there was this Wade's arm around her, Stars thick as cream overhead, the ranch breathing slowly around them. This life she'd built from desperation and determination, from legal documents, and small kindnesses from saying yes when everything sensible said no. "Thank you," Wade said suddenly. "For what?" "For getting on that stage in Boston. For not taking Porter's money. For choosing this." "I didn't choose this," she said. "This chose me. I just had the sense not to run." "Same thing, maybe." "Maybe." William called out in his sleep, "Some dream of horses or adventures," Sarah answered with a sleep.